This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Protect yourself from password leaks with the link down below. I am told VR is cool again. Wait, no, I'm told it's dead. What is it? The story of the current wave of VR is fascinating. After an absurd wave of hype, after the release of the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, you could not attend any tech conference without seeing a dozen VR headsets everywhere. Everyone thought this was the next big thing. It will revitalize PC and phone sales, it was going to be the biggest change in gaming since the jump to 3D. Years later, things have cooled down a little bit, to the point that some analysts rushed to say VR was done.
Virtual reality. For $600, you can buy the Facebook Oculus. Porn and gaming may take off here, but that's it. For a lot less money, I can stare at my phone in the backseat of a car and get nauseous all on my own.
Non-gaming VR existed before the Oculus hype, but even after the giant technological improvements, it still maintains a bit of a niche position, mainly in stuff like virtual training. But even on conferences on LowSpecGamer, gaming is always the thing that attracts the most organic attention. In the gaming world, AAA interest has slowed down, although not completely disappeared, but smaller studios have picked up the slack, and now the software has matured, with proper popular killer app titles popping up. And yet, VR sales have not really exploded into the mainstream. If you're subscribed to this channel, you have likely been screaming at your screen this whole time. VR is too damn expensive. And I keep wondering, why are most of the new headsets not tackling this?
But Alex, you can buy a headset in Walmart for like $40. You can just build a headset with your phone. You have done this.
Well, clearly I got ahead of myself. Let's start terminology and what I mean by VR. VR movement can be classified by degrees of freedom. First, we have 3 degrees of freedom, the tracking or rotation movement using rolling, pitching, and yawing. This allows the tracking of orientation of a headset or device, but not position in space. That means that a device with 3 degrees can track how you look around, but it will always position you in the same spot. 3 degrees will not track your position in a 3D space. 3 degrees is easier to track. Most smartphones can already do this, so this is what you get with Cardboard VR or Samsung VR, or the Walmart headset. Old Wii remotes and now Nintendo Joy-Cons basically do 3 degrees of freedom with additional accelerometers to extrapolate motion, but they cannot track position. For full tracking, you need 6 degrees of freedom, which also adds tracking for 3-dimensional movement. Now you can not only see rotation, but also position in a 3D space in real time. And the same with the controllers. This is much harder, and therefore currently expensive. What options are there for budget-limited gamers? Most of the unique killer apps for VR require some level of 6 degrees for headset and hand controllers. So that eliminates cardboard and phone VR, which is only 3 degrees. There are ways of emulating 6, but it's not super good. PlayStation VR connected to PC is something I have been experimenting, but the setup is a bit of a pain, requiring something like a Kinect sensor to be able to do full 6 degrees of freedom with the controllers, which raises the price and, more importantly, the complexity of the setup. Still, this is something that I plan to explore in the future, just not today. So that leaves us with PC headsets. I have made videos in the past about the older Windows mixed reality headsets which, if you're lucky, can be found for bargain prices and do full 6 degrees, and are also really easy to configure. While their tracking is not at all on the level of some of the expensive headsets, it does good enough for most games, so this is usually my recommended entry point. Problem is, these headsets are cheap because they were not a commercial success, and retailers are trying to get rid of them. And the few next generation's Windows mixed reality headsets are very pricey. So what is going on with the next generation? HTC is still marketing their original Vive headset as their gamer solution, and it's still expensive enough that they offer a payment plan for it, a silent recognition of this cost issue. Their new headsets are either Enterprise or Pro, with Pro price tags attached to that, and their upcoming consumer headset is unlikely to be much cheaper. Valve generated some excitement with the announcement of a new headset with some crazy futuristic features. That cost $1,000. Even some of the weirder experimental headsets can be ridiculously expensive, and that leads me to Oculus. Oculus recently released 2 new headsets, both retailing for $400. While still pricey, it is lower than the original retail price of the first consumer Rift headset, $600, and that was without the controllers. So there's progress being made in the front of reducing the price. I started asking around to see if I could get my hands on these two new headsets to test them for a follow-up to my VR video, but in the meantime, I just could not get an obvious question out of my head. Why is Oculus the only big player in VR who actually seems to be trying to reduce cost? The more I researched, the weirder the story of Oculus' current direction got. So seeing that I was terribly out of my scope, considering I have only owned one 6 degrees PC headset in my life, I decided to send some emails and do some calls.
Okay, so my name's Mike and I run a dedicated virtual reality YouTube channel where I test the latest headsets, I give you guides, check out the latest games, so you can get the best out of your virtual reality experience.
Mike is a prominent member of the VR YouTube community, a growing vertical inside YouTube, and therefore deeply familiar with the details of every headset. Of the two headsets released, the Rift S is the closest to what I expected to see. Something that you connect to your PC to play Steam games, and being primarily a PC gamer, it was the first thing to capture my attention. So before getting my hands on one, I wanted to know how it was different from previous generations.
Yeah, so the Rift S, I've actually got one right behind me here. I actually got my hands on it a few days early before they announced it for release just recently at Facebook F8, so I was very fortunate to get one sent early by Oculus. But how it differentiates itself between the original Rift is that it's got inside-out tracking, so you don't need to set up external sensors anymore. All the tracking is done by the headset itself using the 5 cameras that are dotted around the headset. So the price point of the Rift S is $399 US. When the original Oculus Rift released around 3 years ago, it started off about $600, and then a year later you had to buy the controllers additionally for an extra $200, so it was a really expensive bundle. Eventually that did come down in price and was around $399 US, and occasionally went on sale for $350. So it's come in at quite a good price point, bearing in mind it's sort of a slight upgrade over the original.
How was that reduction in cost possible? Mike had some thoughts on this matter as well.
So with the Rift S, because you have inside-out tracking, they don't have to manufacture these sensors anymore. And each Rift originally shipped with 2 sensors, and then you could buy additional ones if you wanted to have better coverage in your play space. So I think that probably saved a lot of manufacturing costs. The other key thing with the Rift S is that it uses a single panel display behind the lenses. So it runs an LCD panel at 1440 by 2560, and the original Rift was using dual panels, so it used dual OLED panels, which are around 1200 by 1080p each. So by using a single panel, they must have reduced costs there.
Now, while researching this topic, there is one aspect that unexpectedly captured my attention. The reaction to the announcement of the new headset was not entirely positive, as people maybe expected something a bit more ambitious rather than something cheaper. Mike had a more precise take on that.
I think there was just a lot of confusion with the community around the announcement because there wasn't a big presentation or a keynote around this headset. It was just a case of press had access to it early and they were just dropping the specs on the release date, the embargo, which was around GDC. So the thing is, like, everyone on Reddit, the sort of, the Oculus community, they saw all the specs and that's all they really got. They didn't get anything else. So it was just comparing a spec sheet to the original Rift. And of course, the original Rift had been out for 3 years, so everyone's expectations was that they were going to get a true second generation headset. Whereas really what the Rift S is more of a slight bump increase, more of a 1.5 incremental upgrade. So yeah, there was a lot of confusion around the specs because, when you look at the Rift S, it runs at 80 Hz, whereas the original Oculus Rift runs at 90 Hz. The resolution isn't a dramatic leap forward in terms of the original resolution of the original Oculus Rift, and also that you're losing some sort of tracking volume when you go to inside-out tracking, because using external sensors, you can track when your hand is behind your back, for example, whereas, the Rift S struggles with that. So a lot of people saw it as almost a downgrade than a slight upgrade, and there was a lot of confusion around that. However,
the really interesting bit seemed to be the reaction inside Oculus. You see, I had been focused on the Rift S, but Oculus released another $400 headset, the Oculus Quest. The Quest is a standalone headset equipped with a Snapdragon processor. Games ported to the Quest work entirely in their contained system without the need of cables or a connected PC. And if you look at how much Facebook talked about this specific headset, it was very evident that this is the one they wanted to be the start of the show, and the one where the engineering resources are going towards.
You know, if you look at the keynote from F8, it definitely seems like, you know, the Rift S is the Quest's ugly brother. You know, no one really cares about that headset so much. You know, the limelight was solely on Quest, and I think that really is Oculus's main focus right now. And they've kind of brought this Rift S out just to sort of hold a place in the market. Because, you know, you've got Valve coming out with their Index, which is, you know, $1,000 US. And what they're saying is that, you know, we can produce a headset for $399 that can give you, you know, a comparable VR experience, but a massively reduced cost. And you don't have to worry about setting up base stations like you do with the Index. You can just get into VR, room scale VR straight out of the box and start enjoying yourself. When you look at the Quest, you know, like you say, both the Quest and Rift S are $399 US. When you look at the Quest, which is made in-house, you know, it really feels like a premium product. And with all the technology that's crammed into that headset, you know, it's got a Snapdragon 835 processor at its heart. You know, it's got this amazing Insight Oculus tracking system that must have cost a lot of money to develop. I can't imagine they're making any money on the $399 price. Whereas when you look at the Rift S, it may have been designed in-house by Oculus, but it was kind of, you know, manufactured and designed in partnership with Lenovo, and I think they're probably squeezing some margins there and making some money on the hardware. They must be selling the Quest at a loss to get that mass market, you know, introduction there.
And this is in itself interesting because the direction Facebook has turned Oculus towards has caused quite a bit of internal turmoil. Two of the most prominent Oculus founders were the hacky tech guy that was working on the technology to improve VR, Palmer Luckey, and the entrepreneur Brendan Irib, who pushed Luckey to dream bigger. And after the very large Facebook acquisition, Palmer Luckey left the company for no particular reason, and Brendan Irib left later for what sources claim was a disagreement regarding the direction of Oculus.
Yeah, absolutely. An article was released by TechCrunch, who kind of leaked a source close to Brendan Irib, who had left Oculus, and we had no details as to why he'd left. And the rumor was that he quoted that he didn't want to be involved in a race to the bottom with this new Rift S, and that he wanted to focus on a next generation Rift for the enthusiast market. So it seems like Facebook's vision was, you know, we need to make a headset that's cheap and accessible to the mass market, whereas his vision was we need to appease the enthusiast market that made us what we are today.
The idea that Irib, an original co-founder of the company, was leaving because he instead wanted to work on a bigger, more advanced, and possibly more expensive Rift 2, when gaming VR seems to be so limited because of the cost, seemed very weird. I could not help but wonder if some people inside Oculus were falling into a version of the enthusiast trap. The enthusiast trap is a term that I heard from TechAltar to explain why often companies end up doing things that seem to betray their core enthusiast audience. Actually, it makes a bit more sense if he explains this directly.
For every YouTuber, there's an older video that consistently pops out in your analytics, and you're always like, why does this years old thing is always being watched? And I'm willing to bet that for you, how enthusiast brands will betray you probably pops up in your analytics very often. Can you summarize the enthusiast trap for us?
Sure. So the concept of the enthusiast trap is that tech companies, especially ones that produce products that enthusiasts would really like. So that would be, for example, companies like Oculus or companies like Pebble or companies like OnePlus. They start off by focusing on enthusiast users. And this appears to be a fantastic strategy at first, because if you target enthusiast users, you don't need very heavy advertising. You don't need to buy billboard ads and TV ads and stuff. The enthusiasts will just find you as soon as you have a cool product. They will do the marketing for you by word of mouth. They'll do their YouTube videos. They go on Reddit and talk about you. They might even give you free money in the form of Kickstarter before you even launch your product, or they'll get invites to your products. They'll go jump through hoops to get to you, and they're willing to deal with even beta hardware. So this is at first a very attractive proposition. But then companies that follow this path fall into an enthusiast trap, is what I call it, where they very quickly outgrow the enthusiast market. Because the enthusiast market is not a very sustainable one on the long term. If you think about it, there's a small audience. This audience is extremely demanding, so you always have to be up to date and you always have to provide the best possible product experience. They're very cost conscious, so if there's a competitor that offers the same thing that you do, but for $5 less, the enthusiasts are very aware of that and they'll switch ASAP. At that point, when they realize that they've kind of outgrown this market, which happens very quickly, the company has a dilemma, which is, do they stay with the audience, which is difficult because it might be too small on the long term. They kind of remain insignificant in the grand scale of things. Or do they leave that audience behind and start focusing more on mainstream users, in which case that is again difficult because you leave your core user base behind and enthusiasts will get angry.
The people who felt betrayed on the trap are usually the audience, and there's always some degree of that since Oculus was bought by Facebook. But in this particular case, it does seem that the feelings were coming from inside the company itself.
Yeah, this is actually very interesting because, as you said, it's usually the users who are revolting. Although I've seen some negativity towards Oculus going to a race to the bottom, I feel like it's overall a relatively positive message. People tend to seem to like the Quest as it opens up new experiences and stuff. But it's clear from the reporting that the founders feel kind of betrayed by being forced into this path that they don't want to take. I think you see this throughout Facebook, actually. So the three big acquisitions that Facebook has had, which is Oculus, WhatsApp, and Instagram, you see a very similar story in all three of them, where the founders have all recently left Facebook. And it all seems to be because their vision for their product is clashing with the vision for the product that Zuckerberg has. Zuckerberg is under extreme pressure from all sides because of his platforms being involved with elections and political stuff. We all know about that. Because there's a constant push for being extremely profitable. And I think he's kind of become a little paranoid in wanting to keep control as much as possible, as he feels that the people are calling for him to leave the company or for his company to be split up. I think he's doing the opposite. He's reasserting his dominance and he's pushing out all the critical voices or all the strong people in the company who would want to, move the company into a different direction. And actually for all three companies, for WhatsApp, for example, apparently the founder left because he wanted to focus more on privacy and he didn't want to mix his stuff together with the Facebook platform. For Instagram, the founders left apparently, again, because they wanted to keep their platform relatively clean and pure and not mix it together with all the Facebook stuff. And then for Oculus, as we talked about, I think all three cases are very similar because the founders have a strong product vision and they want to keep the integrity of the product that they envisioned. Whereas Zuckerberg wants to make as much money as possible. They want to reach a huge audience and they want to push as many ads to them as possible. So I think it's quite coming from the top of Facebook, yes.
So it does seem like the idea of a standalone headset combined with a culture shock between Oculus and Facebook led to both the change in direction and the exit of the founders. But there's one last person I wanted to talk to before moving on.
So my name is Blake Harris. I am the author of Console Wars, which is a book about the battle between Sega and Nintendo in the early 90s. And then most recently, I wrote a book called The History of the Future.
The History of the Future is a novel that chronicles the history of Oculus until Lucky's exit. In the process of working for this video, I read it on its entirety to get a more in-depth perspective on how Oculus and its culture came to be. And afterwards, Mr. Harris, the author himself, agreed to give me some opinions on the current Oculus Quest dilemma and the clashes inside Oculus.
Well, I'm glad you noticed that, because to me, there's this great commercial here. One person on the phone is talking about frog insurance, like for the animal that goes ribbit, ribbit, and the other one saying fraud insurance for like fraudulent activity. And they both are saying different things, but they say to each other, I think we're saying the same thing.
Just to be clear, you are saying frog protection, right?
Yeah, fraud protection.
Frog protection.
Fraud protection.
Frog. Frog.
Fraud.
I think we're on the same page.
We're totally on the same page.
And that's how I felt a lot when researching this book, and I had the benefit of hindsight when I'm going through these old emails and listening to these conversations, because between Palmer Luckey, Brendan Arib, and Mark Zuckerberg, the one thing they all had in common was incredible passion for VR. But in terms of their vision, they really did have pretty different visions, but they would always sort of share these different visions and see it as, oh, well, we're saying the same thing, even though they really weren't. And so, like, to your point, you know, Palmer's vision was so grounded in affordability. The number one thing was that anybody should be able to use this and do whatever they want with it, you know, modify it. His history with Mod Retro sort of explains that background. Brendan's very much an aficionado of Apple products, and Apple products have closed systems. They're more expensive than, you know, Android devices, and they're beautiful. And those are all good things, but they're not typically affordable. And then Mark's vision is sort of in between those things, and it's focused more on what you'd be able to do with it than the actual hardware. It was always very interesting that because they had the passion for it, they all wanted to be on the same page, but they really weren't as much on the same page as they seemed to think they were, or at least as they seemed to accept at the time.
Are you familiar with the TechCrunch article that was reading about this?
A year and a half after Palmer was fired from Facebook, Brendan also left Oculus and Facebook on terms that, you know, I think it was a mutual departure, but it was clearly the result of Brendan not being happy with the direction and Facebook sort of not really seeing things the same way. And there was that TechCrunch article. And I've also spoken to Brendan since his departure. And for him, it does really kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, that he comes from that Apple school of thought that products need to be pristine and beautiful and really high scale and high brow. And Facebook with Oculus Go, especially at the time, even before Quest, really wanting to make it as cheap as possible and as affordable as possible. And that really clashed with Brendan's vision for it. I should mention, to help also explain where Brendan was coming from, that so many times when we would speak during my writing the book, so many times when we'd speak while he was still at Oculus, he always felt that there was only one chance to make a first impression. So if you're trying to reach the mainstream audience, if you have a product that isn't amazing and perfect, then you're going to lose them forever. And so that's why I even mentioned in the book that he was particularly not into the Google Cardboard, because that was the epitome of being affordable VR, but was definitely experience that I don't know if anybody was excited to go back to. Whatever you think of Brendan or his vision, I think the one thing you could say is that every product he's ever put out is sort of beautiful and really user-friendly. So I think it was only a matter of time before that became a bit of a problem.
Okay, so in that article, one of the things that the sort of community at large has discussed the most is this quote that Iribe wasn't interested in a race to the bottom in terms of performance. So will this quote refer to the Oculus Quest and the direction of Facebook putting resources towards standalone VR and the cancellation of the Rev 2?
No, I think that I understand why that quote has gained a lot of traction, and I think that that does reflect the perspective that Brendan has shared with me since his departure. But I know that he was really excited for the Quest. Like, in his mind, the Quest was very different than the Go, and it was almost like two different directions with Go and with Quest. And he really did see Quest as this in-between piece between mobile VR and PC VR. And the Quest really does represent probably what the shared vision between Brendan and Palmer more than anything, whereas the Go is a little bit more affordable. And Brendan saw that as a direction that could be getting cheaper, and that could be what's going out to the mainstream. And he saw that as a bad, as a race to the bottom. One other thing I would add is that Brendan always expressed the importance to me of sick stuff. So, there's even a line in the book about how Brendan was not very excited about the Samsung product, the Samsung Gear VR product, and is sort of condescending about it. The book implies that's his opinion of mobile VR, and he has told me since then, and this is consistent with what he said, is that it wasn't mobile VR that was the problem, it was 3DOF VR was the problem. So I think that because the Quest has 6DOF, like that is not the race to the bottom in Brendan's opinion.
It seems, to me at least, that the new Oculus headsets are the only ones that are trying to push the idea of making VR more accessible from a cost perspective. Why do you think Facebook/Oculus is the only company trying to do this? Is it a lack of technology? Is it a matter of ideology? Is it the fact that Facebook is the only company with pockets deep enough to get there?
Perhaps the simplest way to say this is that, as the book makes clear, neither Palmer nor Brendan, especially John Carmack and Michael Abrash, none of these people were power Facebook users. None of them were big Facebook fans when they made the acquisition. So the acquisition to them was not about, oh, this Facebook is this company who we love and agree with in so many ways. It really was about getting Facebook's resources to deliver this grand vision. And it's so much of that is based on what you just said about having deeper pockets. So in my opinion, the reason why Facebook is the only company that's trying to put out a $500, $400, $300 headset that has 6DOF tracking and that can be the kind of headset that a kid would open on Christmas morning and fall in love with VR is because they're the only ones who have the money and are willing to make the investment and lose billions of dollars until the point where it starts to become profitable. And obviously HTC can't do that based on, their investor calls. I don't know the exact situation that they're in financially, but they can't subsidize the industry for several years. And Valve probably could a lot more so than HTC, but that's not really their brand. And they also know their audience better. It's hardcore PC gamers largely, and they're going to cater to that audience and give them the best of the best of the best. I kind of think that it's very interesting that Oculus Quest came out at a time when neither Brendan nor Palmer are still at the company, because part of the acquisition to Facebook was to get to this point where they could put out a headset like this that could be this cheap and this technologically superior. And I guess the sacrifice they made was, they made a lot of sacrifices to get there. And obviously personally are no longer with the company, so that was a big sacrifice. But I think that it's not a surprise to me that they're both very happy with Oculus Quest. And I think that if you had told both of them back in 2014, all right, 5 years from now, Facebook is going to put out Oculus Quest and show the specs, but you guys aren't going to be at the company, both of them probably still would have done it because they cared that much about getting Quest out there, because it's the only headset that seems to be capable of doing what you're describing, that's beyond the enterprise and beyond the hardcore gaming audience, and that really is trying to drive the cost down and attract new VR users and enthusiasts.
After all those trials and tribulations, it does seem the current state of VR comes down to a clash between the vision of getting the product right from the very start, with all the cost implications of that, or an iterative approach that risks burning out people, but that could lead to a key product that jumps the industry back into the mainstream. But products speak louder than words. So, what do the products say? I managed to borrow a Rift test for a brief test, and was surprised in several fronts. My only real point of comparison is the cheap Windows Mixed Reality I own, and in that sense, the obvious spec improvements are evident, such as the slightly better field of view, better ergonomics, and the much superior tracking. But there are some details that disappointed me, particularly that it was a bit inconvenient. When I talked to Mike about the barrier that is limiting VR adoption, he had some interesting words to say.
I think it's price and accessibility. So what people don't want to do is they don't want to spend time and effort setting up sensors, running extension cables across your room, and adding PCIe USB cards to their PCs to bump up the USB ports. They don't want to do that. They want it very easy, and they want it to work on sort of relatively mediocre hardware. And I think that's what Oculus are trying to do with the Rift S.
I am inclined to agree with him. Initially, I had not even considered the idea of an Oculus or a Vive because of the price, but ultimately, I stuck with my cheap Windows Mixed Reality in the long run because there was no way I was going to make VR a recurrent part of my gaming routine if I had to set up base stations on my very tiny living room. One of my favorite aspects of my headset is how I just have to plug two things into my PC and I'm playing in a matter of minutes. The Rift S uses a superior version of the same inside-out tracking, which means no base stations needed. But the headset only works over DisplayPort, does not play well with HDMI adapters, and is straight up incompatible with the way many laptops are wired. I could not get it to work on any laptop I own, which is a huge inconvenience. Now, the minimum requirements of the Oculus Rift are not terribly bad. A GTX 1050 Ti is somewhat accessible. However, I have tried proving in the past that if you have some resistance to a certain type of motion sickness, you can get away with some eyebrow-raising low specs for VR, and I was interested to see if the Oculus Rift S will follow suit. Since I could not use my laptop, I put together a budget system with an entry-level CPU and GPU. I have noticed in the past that some of the best VR titles out there are extraordinarily well optimized to the point that you can easily get away with playing on something more modest, and the Rift S did not prove to cause an exception here, as my modest GPU could keep up with the very high frame rates. Just like with regular gaming, you will need better stuff for heavier games, but I could not shake off the bad feeling of not being able to play on my laptop due to port issues. By contrast, I managed to make an appointment to try the Oculus Quest myself and wow. Seriously, I did not expect it. Not only is the tracking the best that I have personally tried, but after playing around with VR without a cable to accidentally step on, I'm having a hard time going back. And most people I spoke with were of the opinion that this was the right direction.
I think the Quest, it is the form factor that is the most viable in the consumer market, in my opinion. Like the self-contained, inside-out tracking, as soon as it becomes powerful enough, I think this, to me, seems to be the form factor that I know I would want to use. I
think Oculus Quest is the first headset that we have that is quote-unquote affordable, and I'm not, $400 is a lot of money, so I'm not going to say it's cheap, but it is the kind of thing that is a very similar price to a console, and it doesn't require a PC. I think up until this point, it has been very hard. It has been a very hard sell to the mainstream audience because even when the Rift comes down in price or the Vive comes down in price, you still need the PC, and that's not only very expensive to an average person, but it's also kind of confusing. I like that the Oculus Quest is the first thing that out of the box is a somewhat affordable experience that the mainstream audience could really get into.
During my time with the Rift S, my favorite experience was to share with others. When done well, VR is not only a new dimension of gaming, but a pathway for new and different people to discover the joy of gaming. When I started this video, my eyes were on the Rift S alone. Being able to access games from several sources beyond the Oculus Store and custom Beat Saber songs was too important. But after some of the setup issues and trying out VR without wires, I'm inclined more towards the Quest as a consumer, especially now that it seems to be getting custom songs and PC streaming capabilities. For VR, I might just want to do something that works, and I'm willing to bet that this is an important thing for many other people outside the super hardcore VR enthusiast crowd. So both of these headsets are still too expensive for me to recommend as budget options. But the only one that seems to have a chance to improve this and get VR into the mainstream is Facebook. And that is a scary thought.
I can't say enough nice things about Oculus Quest. I don't know that I would recommend it to people, though, because of the Facebook aspect. I don't know what data they're collecting, so I think that is a valid concern. But just in terms of a piece of hardware and obviously the software that underlies it, I'm 100% blown away and so impressed by it, and I do hope that it is a very popular item this holiday season and that it helps bring it to a more mainstream audience. It's definitely the best chance that VR has had.
Honestly, I understand the sentiment. Even ignoring the constant scandal, just on this year alone my Facebook and separate Instagram passwords have leaked online, which is always a bit of a panic-inducing situation for anyone. Lucky for me, the damage was contained, because I used Dashlane. Dashlane is like the Swiss Army knife of internet security. It protects your passwords, secures your internet browsing with a VPN, and alerts you of major leaks, all in one software and cheaper than the 3 software you will usually need for that. With Dashlane, you can auto-generate strong passwords and store them in encrypted storage that only you have the master password to, so you don't need to worry about Dashlane getting hacked. It includes a VPN that you can use to secure your connection if you're connected on a public Wi-Fi or to access region lock software software, as I did for PUBG Lite, and it has a dark web monitoring software which keeps saving my life because Facebook cannot stop leaking my passwords everywhere. Where was I? Oh yes, go to dashlane.com/LowSpecGamer for a 30-day trial or use the code LowSpecGamer for 10% off discount on an annual subscription. Thank you to Dashlane for warning me every time my passwords get leaked and for sponsoring this video and you for watching.